Well, welcome everyone to another Spiritual Science as Social Activism and Self-Initiation Loft Talk. Delighted to see a full house here to delve into this deep, mysterious, and profound subject entitled Lifting the Veil on Mental Illness, a Spiritual Scientific Perspective. Yes, very warm to see that you all came out in the cold. All I can say is, I'm glad I didn't have to go out tonight.
It's not that bad.
No? Okay, well, it's going to get colder.
Okay.
It'll probably be colder by the time you head home, so. Just to cheer you up.
It's warm in here.
It's warm and cozy in here. There's lots of physical warmth, there's lots of soul warmth, and we're going to create spiritual warmth. So, yes, this is indeed a very interesting subject, as I've been hearing from you all. Many of you saying you want to come out and hear about this. Because, as the slogan says, mental illness affects us all. And in fact, statistically, 1 in 4 people are affected by this, the nature of this subject. And 3 out of 100 will have a psychotic episode at some time in their lifetime. So I can actually say I am one of the 3 out of 100 because I've been down that road. And I will be talking a bit about that tonight. Just a little bit more on the statistical ends of things, reading up on kind of the medical take on mental illness. Signs of mental illness first usually appear in late adolescence or early 20s. There's people here in their late adolescence, early 20s. It occurs in both men and women across all cultures and socioeconomic groups. So no one is immune to this. Women are affected by psychotic illness at a later age than men. But women respond better than men to most treatments. Women have times when risk of relapse is greater, especially around times before menstruation or after childbirth or hormonally significant times in their lives. So that is why it has become a big focus in our society, in our times. And of course, we all know about the scientific medical end of mental illness treatment. It's come out more and more into the public view, which is good. But there are different views on this. Of course, there's the corporatization of our health industry, which is a concern. The government is trying to do what it can to uphold its responsibility to provide health care for people. So one of the aspects of that is something called the DSM. People heard of the DSM? Yeah, this is created by the American Psychiatric Association. It stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And it's what doctors, psychiatrists use to diagnose and classify mental disorders. Now in its 5th edition, this edition they now have up to 400 different labelings of disorders. Which has actually raised some complaints. For one, there's a complaint that the task force that put together this 5th edition was asked to sign a disclosure agreement to not reveal what was being put into it. And so, in effect, the whole thing was done in secret, which has angered people because it was not a collective work amongst the medical community to debate and dispute and help in shaping of the DSM. So there was a lack of transparency, which they feel lacks credibility. And the fact that over 70% of the task force members had a direct connection to the medical industry, i.e. the pharmaceutical industry and so on. So it kind of smells a little bit suspicious there when you have something being put together in secret by people that are connected to the medical industry, and then it's being used by at large in the medical community. And the British Psychological Society responded to this 5th edition of the DSM, saying that clients and general public are negatively affected by the continued and continuous medicalization of their natural and normal responses to their experiences, which demand helping responses, but which do not reflect illnesses so much as normal individual variation. Good for the British, yes. The British Psychological Society suggested a change from using diagnostic frameworks, read pigeonholes, and labeling, to a description-based one of individual specific experience problems, and that mental disorders are better explored as part of a spectrum shared with normality. Yeah, like that's great. Yes, how enlightened sounding that is, that everything fits into the spectrum somewhere. And it's not like, oh, well, that doesn't fit into human nature.
Yeah, therefore it has to get shelved over there with that drug.
Precisely. So, part of the issue, particularly from my perspective, as someone who looks at it from a spiritual scientific angle, is that perhaps we're being spiritually seduced into looking at ourselves in a rather damaging way, an erroneous way, that leads to further problems, i.e. low self-esteem, character disorders, depression, and so forth, because of the way that normal variations of behavior are being handled and frameworked and pigeonholed, and then ultimately treated perhaps with some sort of drug. So yeah, increasingly in our society, people are receiving this labeling which makes them feel like they're a damaged product, that they're a defect from the factory. They fell off the truck during delivery, or fell off the change table, after being born, and it's like, oh, okay, well, but this is part of a larger spectrum, part of a larger way of looking at ourselves. And in fact, I want to repeat several times kind of a mantra. I don't know if it was John Lennon who came up with this, or he just put it in a song from somewhere else, but it's about how we are spiritual beings having a human experience. Right? At our core, we are a spiritual being incarnated into a physical existence to have experiences as a human, which may include, any of the variations of human behavior, including things like brain damage or what have you. Like, that's part of being human, breaking your leg, breaking a part of your brain, and to live and deal with that. So I'm starting off kind of looking at this dark side of the scientific revolution that we're in right now. And I actually want to read a quote from Blaise Pascal. So he was a mathematician in the 1600s, contemporary of Galileo and Newton and Kepler, one of the founders of modern physics. Ironically, one of the founders of modern physics, who says this in his book Penses, or Thoughts. The symptom I see humanity suffering with is a sense of deep-seated fear. When I once looked into the heavens, I saw a spiritual world. I knew my God exists. Now I am told by science and philosophy that there are boundaries to knowledge whereby I cannot know. This creates tremendous fear and angst in my soul. End of quote. This is someone back in the 1600s complaining about what science was doing to distort the sense of self. And I've said this before, that that's the greatest casualty of the scientific revolution is the sense of self that humans have. Up to this point, every religion, every spiritual movement, every jot and tittle of scripture has been written to say that we are divine and that we come from a spiritual world and will return to a spiritual world. So this is unprecedented to live in this kind of paradigm matrix where we look out to the heavens and it's just really, I don't know, atoms, molecules. I mean, we're made to feel so tiny in the paradigm that we have. So Pascal's diagnosis is that we are terrified by emptiness, and science has emptied the heavens of spirituality. And his prognosis is that we need to instill hope in a future by reopening the boundaries of knowledge, to learn to extend our consciousness consciously beyond the threshold. And that word threshold is something that's going to be repeated this evening as we look deeper into the spiritual scientific perspective. But this opening of boundaries to knowledge is the one thing that science will not consent to. Even though their technology extends our physical ability to look out into space further and further, to look down into matter deeper and deeper, the one thing they will not consent is there's something beyond the five senses, the physical five senses by which we can know and access and acquire knowledge. That's the line that they've drawn in the sand and are willing to fight tooth and nail against anything contrary to that because of this sacred cow called scientific methodology. That's what they hang it all on, is it has to fit in with scientific methodology, which is a fantastic tool. It's wonderful that we've developed the intellect and the capacity for reason and to theorize and to extrapolate and all of the wonderful mental gymnastics of the mind. But to deny that we can access through our spiritual being, as our ancestors did, and spoke of and wrote of and put in all the myths and so forth of our literary legacy that's given to us, is really cutting us off at the knees, cutting us off at the source, and diminishing us. So in some ways it amounts to an attack of ignorance and darkness upon our consciousness, which is why people like Graham Hancock did his talk on TED Talk called The War on Consciousness. And after he did, of course, the TED Talks wanted to delete his talk, along with Rupert Sheldrake's talk, another great spiritual scientist who I'll be talking about in a future evening on scientism. I've got a talk called Scientism as the new dogma. I'm doing, I think, a month from now. No, 6 weeks from now. So, now I appreciate the scientific methodology. Like, that really is a wonderful tool. So I want to keep this all in a positive context because it is helping us with our spiritual revolution. And that this is, we're still in the Renaissance. If you didn't realize, the Renaissance didn't end. We had the Renaissance beginning with, the scientific thinking and the Industrial Revolution, and, the drug revolution and the technological revolution. But we have to bring back what's been lost, which is our awareness of our spiritual nature and the consciousness that comes with that. Because if we're going to develop the new clairvoyance to augment the intellect that's come on board over the last 2,000-3,000 years, we're going to need scientific exactitude and clear thinking so we don't fall into another dark ages of superstition and delusion and illusion, which is always a possibility when you get on that slippery slope of spiritualizing your thinking. And it happens. It happened to me. which I'll talk about in a moment. But I'll take a moment to talk about a friend of mine who about 3 weeks ago got in touch with me and said, "Oh, I'd like to come over for tea and catch up." And she came over and I thought, this is interesting timing, because she's one of my friends who is diagnosed with a mental illness. And I'll call her Mary, just for privacy's sake. And so when Mary arrived for tea, it was like, oh wow, would you mind sharing a little bit about your journey with mental illness? And so on the spot, she consented to. We spent the next couple of hours where she shared with me this incredible journey that she went on. I met her back in 2006 when I was hosting talks for the Rudolf Steiner Center downtown, and she was interested in spiritual science, and she showed up. She was also interested in eurythmy, which is a form of spiritual movement that was developed by Rudolf Steiner. And I'm very interested in that. I've done some training in eurythmy, and she wanted to go and do some training. So I offered for her to come and live here with me, so she could save money to go and do this incredible training of eurythmy. So she did, which was an interesting year for me, because just prior to that was the beginning of her, you might call, the advent of her mental illness while she was studying music at Humber College. And when she was there, she did notice that she developed a sensitivity to sound. So much so that when she did exams there, they actually provided a special space for her to do the exams, so she'd be isolated from other sounds. And that's the first time they'd ever done that at Humber College, just to cater to her needs, which was great. She went to the guidance counselor on one occasion and started to share with the guidance counselor some of her experiences. The guidance counselor said, "I think you're having a spiritual experience," which, she took in a very positive way. The guidance counselor wasn't able to do much more than that. He was there, with his limitations as a college counselor. But from there, she went out to seek help with her spiritual awakening. She explored some churches and whatnot, but unfortunately wasn't able to get support there. Often these older institutions really don't have the resources or the understanding on how to support spiritual awakening in modern times. They have their teachings and whatnot, which can have value, but she was not able to find much support through there. So as her troubles began to deepen, she turned to the medical system, the mental health system here in Toronto. And from what she told them, they ended up diagnosing her with social phobia. And that's what she told me when she moved in here. She had a diagnosis of social phobia back in 2006. Because she felt overwhelmed when she was around people, she said that she could hear other people's thoughts. Other people's thoughts would be in her head, and she wouldn't know if it was her thoughts or other people's thoughts, and often the thoughts she would hear inwardly from people didn't line up with what they were telling her outwardly. So she began to develop a real distrust for people, because she'd be hearing their words, but inwardly she'd be hearing something else from them. And this, of course, compounded her social phobia, and actually a sense of terror. At the bottom of it, it's really a sense of terror. And that's another word that's going to come up in tonight's talk, is dealing with terror. So she didn't tell the people in the medical establishment fully of what she was experiencing, because she was really afraid of them too, and what they would do to her in the system. So she was delighted to be living here and shared a lot of spiritual science with her, and she at different times talked about how she may be autistic, and when she was here just 3 weeks ago, it was that's a preferred label to have over schizophrenic. Schizophrenic has a lot heavier stigma to it than to say you're autistic, because autistic has, certain things. Sometimes autistic people are called savants because they have a superminds. Even though they have a certain mental disability, they can also demonstrate profound abilities beyond the norm, such as rapid arithmetical calculations, incredible memory, incredible art that they can do, incredible musical abilities. So they're looked at in kind of an esteemed way. And in the New Age movement, they're often referred to as indigo children or star children that are born through light workers, and they bring special gifts into the world, but they don't necessarily fit very well into the world because of these sometimes social ineptness that autistic people have. She did, here, have some episodes that I witnessed firsthand, which at that time I really didn't know what I know now, and I just kind of observed and held space and maintained a strong friendship with her, but at the same time kind of scratching my head and wondering what's going on, what should I do. Then she left to go and do this eurythmy training down in the US, but that really began a dark night of the soul for her because she had problems fitting in there. There was not good feedback from the people there. There wasn't support. She tried going to some other communities to get direct support for her sense of self and her social phobia, but she got bounced around a lot, and then finally ended up back here in Toronto, back at CAMH, which just have right across the street here, which is sometimes comforting to know, like if I need to just head across there in an emergency, not that far to go. Actually, she went to the one up on College Street where they deal with these sorts of things. And there she let it be known more of what she was experiencing, and that was in 2010, like that was 4 years later that she went undiagnosed, but finally got diagnosed with schizophrenia. And there got treated with CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, and some mindfulness training, and of course a battery of different medications until they find one that would work for her, because she was getting all sorts of side effects as they usually do. She's put on weight and experienced physical paralysis at different times, but now she has stabilized things. She's actually about to finish a college program that she's been in for a few years, and the medication has helped to tune down the voices. Unfortunately, it also tunes down her own capacity for intuition. That's a common side effect, is you turn off the bad, but you also end up turning off the good in some ways. But if she goes off her medication, the symptoms come back. So it lets you know that these things are not a cure. It's just really some way to manage a condition and the symptom. So we had a great talk when she was here for tea, and she was very thankful for how I was able to ask questions that no psychiatrist would be able to ask her, that I was able to hold it in the context of spiritual science, which is what I'm wanting to do here tonight. It also reminded me of a book that I saw back in the 80s. I can't remember the title, but it was something like Lunatics, Crackpots, and Other Mad Heroes. And it was a celebration of people that have gone over the edge. Musicians, artists, genius, that pushed the envelope, pushed the threshold, but lost their minds in the process. But they were trying. They were working at expanding their consciousness, but will go down in history as lunatics, crackpots, and Other Mad Heroes. I can't remember the title. I wish I tried looking it up, but if anybody knows what I'm talking about, it'd be great to look at that book, because I feel the same with my friend Mary. To celebrate her for struggle, and how she's just about to graduate from college, and she's going to go and find some way to contribute to society in a meaningful way. Like, this is, I think she said, the 5th college program that she's been in, and they've all kind of ended in Dark Night of the Soul, but she's going to finish this one this spring, and it's so wonderful. I'm going to have to find some way to celebrate her accomplishment. So now, turning our attention to the spiritual scientific perspective of things. I always like to have a stack of books here, which I'm going to look at one by one. And of course, I usually refer to this one at every meeting. It's one of Rudolf Steiner's classic books called Knowledge of the Higher Worlds. And this is the first book of his that I read. This is not even the first copy. I've gone through about 4 copies. Because it really is, in some ways, the classic esoteric literature on moving towards the threshold. And I'll talk about it a little bit later in the talk, because in the last 2 chapters he really deals with this issue of threshold experiences and what they're like, and how to identify them and manage them in your own life. Another book here is where I got the title for this evening, Lifting the Veil of Mental Illness, written by a gentleman, William Bento, who I met about 25 years ago when I was first embarking on my quest and my seeking understanding in these different subjects. And he just passed away last year, but he has worked over the years as a psychologist, a counselor, working out of spiritual science, which is so fantastic. Like, he was really there to support people of all different levels and capacities from the background of spiritual science. So, some of the things he talks about is how, and I like this thing we got to in the beginning about how everything is somewhere in the spectrum of human dynamics. And he paints this picture of how the overall environment of nature is one that's always seeking equanimity and wholeness. Balance. Equanimity, balance. To a state of wholeness. But it's in a dynamic state. So in our dualistic system, there's always this fluctuation. It's like the guy said, I know where this center is. I see it every time I swing past it. So nature's always kind of out of balance, right? In this world, the three-dimensional dualistic world we live in, there's this kind of out of balancing and seeking a place of wholeness. And because we are in some ways products of the environment, we're like that too. We're just all kind of somewhere off the scale of equanimity and wholeness. And that's the human journey. He then goes on to look at the Greek myths. And I love that idea. I've always thought that myths and fables and fairy tales are psychological portraits. And it's fascinating to approach them that way. And in a way, that was medicine being given when they were told in the original time of storytelling and creating the myths and whatnot. They were passing the medicine of these psychological portraits out into the souls of the people. And that the myths they seem to be about the affairs of the gods, Demeter and Persephone and all that. But really, they are an expression of the trials of human nature. So the people back then would be hearing these stories about the gods, but indirectly they were being able to identify in an unconscious way about their own trials and tribulations as a human being, and to link up with the archetypes that's there. Now, one of the neat things about Greek culture is they were really focused on seeking balance and wholeness. You can see it in their art, you can see it in their culture, in their politics. They really were trying to create an environment for a human to grow into a balanced and whole state. And so they had these three ideals. The first ideal is that of goodness, the second one is that of beauty, and the third one is that of truth. Goodness, beauty, and truth. And of course, you're going to have the opposite of an ideal. So instead of goodness, you're going to have evil, and instead of beauty, you're going to have something that's marred, and instead of truth, you're going to have illusion or deception. And all of those are really kind of a form of madness, or lack of wholeness and equanimity. The evil, the marred, and the illusory. Now, it's just as a side note, when I was working as a Waldorf school teacher, within their curriculum, within their perspective of what the human being is, they say that during those first 7 years of life, from birth to age 7, you really want to create an environment for the child to experience goodness. They're going to absorb goodness. That's the period when their physical body is developing the most, from birth to 7. So in that environment, they need to experience goodness in the physical environment and absorb that into their physical nature. From 7 to 14, when they're developing their emotional life the most, leading up to adolescence, that's when they should be experiencing beauty. So to experience the arts and those first years of grade school, to be engaging in art and experiencing the beauty of cultures through history and patterns and things like that. And then in the third set of 7 years, leading up to adulthood, so that's from 14 to 21, then they should be experiencing truth, because they're developing their intellect during that time. And so they need to figure out what truth is, and what error is, and what falsity is, and what illusion is. So, yeah, they're using the intellect to get into the sciences, and they get into debating and things like that. So those ideals are really a way to help a human being to develop equanimity and wholeness out of their own unique seeking. If they have this instilled in them in those first 21 years of life, then it's something they can recognize when they go out into the world and they go, oh yes, that speaks to me of beauty. And that's not to say that everyone's going to have the same taste of what beauty is, but there's something essential behind things that will have that sense of goodness, beauty, and truth. And then they can find their own unique way of expressing it through themselves, be it through writing or a song or what have you. But of course, those are just ideals. That's the ideal, and nobody has the perfect upbringing, right? So we get into our 20s and, we're like topsy-turvy, and we're certainly not finished in our development. So we spend the rest of our life really seeking these things to build our own unique picture of wholeness. Which leads me to the next book. From Normal to Healthy. Subtitled Paths to the Liberation of Consciousness. Written by another spiritual scientist, Georg Kulevind, who I had the opportunity to meet once. He has also gone to the other side. But interesting, just the title, From Normal to Healthy, Paths to the Liberation of Consciousness. Liberation of consciousness. Well, then that must mean that our consciousness is not liberated. If you're just living normal, the default is that you are not free. That's the given. You're not free from the get-go. And if you think you're free, you're less free than the guy who knows he's not free and he's working on getting free. Right? So we don't want to fool ourselves about this, thinking that we have freedom. But of course that brings up the question of what is freedom? And there's different variations on that. Some people in this world and in their circumstances are trying to find just political freedom. They may live under some oppressive, tyrannical dictatorship. And so they're having to fight outwardly to find political freedom, human rights, and so forth, which of course, that kind of fight will liberate your consciousness inwardly. Anything you're going to do outwardly is going to support inner development. But then there's also those that are seeking freedom, such as a teenager. A teenager is seeking freedom beyond the confines of his parental home, right? He wants to find personal freedom, not political freedom, just personal freedom beyond the confines of his parental home. And that's a different kind of striving for freedom. He's not having to throw hand grenades or shoot Uzis and things like that. He's trying to find his inner steps, his inner footing for his own personal freedom. So this thing about expansion and the expansion of his consciousness is in those two words, beyond and confines, or beyond the threshold. It's thresholds that we meet that we have to expand beyond to find personal freedom. But this is where it's a slippery slope. Because when we go beyond the parental home, for example, where we're protected and have comfort, and all of a sudden we step across the threshold out into the big bad world, it might lead to emancipation, or it might lead to more incarceration, mental, emotional, spiritual incarceration, or mental illness of some kind. And that's basically what happened to me. I have left my confines of my parental home and had to return several times, holing up in the basement, licking my wounds, didn't know my anus from an ecological excavation, and trying to figure out my next route back out into the larger world. So it's all spiritual though. Whether it's political freedom or personal freedom that you're striving for, it's all spiritual because we are spiritual beings having a human experience. So, yeah, more on this personal quest for freedom. A lot of it has to do with finding the blind spots in our psyche that's running the show, right? Because we might have tyrannical dictatorships inside demanding action. And that inner dictator can come in many different forms. It can be in the form of automatic programs that you run, habits that run automatically, parental tapes, parental voices. It can come from peer pressure, do this, do this. It can come from unchecked desires. Oh, I've got a desire, I have to follow it. My heart tells me to do this, got to go that way. Or unresolved issues from the past. And this is where we get into looking at karma. That how does our karma of past lives influence our behavior in the present moment? Which is why the talk following this talk in 2 weeks is called Karma and Reincarnation, Old and New Views. Very important subject to understand and keep in consciousness as we seek liberation. So, as the author of this book, From Normal and Healthy, says, liberation starts with attention. Attention is the starting point towards liberation. Or you could call it mindfulness. Which is why in this book he actually lays out the eightfold path of Buddha. the path of mindfulness. That's part of what he lays out here, along with Rudolf Steiner's ideas on the new cognition, the birthing of your new cognitive capacities. So it's kind of some of the old Buddhist stuff, along with the more recent spiritual scientific work of Rudolf Steiner, who's trying to guide people through books like this to bring this thing we call intellect, which actually separates us from the spiritual world. That's why modern science has got this separation from the spiritual world, because it's all intellectual. And that's fine, we want our intellect. But now we need to bring in the clairvoyance. We need to bring in the spiritual capacities to be able to see into the spiritual world, to be able to hear into the spiritual world, to be able to know intuitively and work them together. So that is basically the evolutionary journey we're on currently. It's the combining of the intellect with the new clairvoyance. And I say new clairvoyance, we'll talk about what the old clairvoyance looked like in a moment. But when we're not walking that path too well, that's when pathology arises. That's really at the core of pathology, is we're not combining these capacities and powers and successfully having them work together. Which brings me to the next book, called Man on the Threshold, written by another spiritual scientist, Bernard Liebegood, Dutch fellow. And I think he actually had I'm not sure if he had a direct connection to Rudolf Steiner, like actually met Rudolf Steiner when he was alive, but he's taken much of Steiner's indications and put it into a new paradigm of the new psychology, or what some spiritual scientists call psychosophy, or wisdom of the soul, psychosophy, Sophia and psychosophy. So here's the subtitle, The Challenge of Inner Development. So here's this word threshold. And it's really, well, I'll read one of the quotes from Rudolf Steiner. He says, the symptom of humanity is that all of humankind is crossing the threshold of the spiritual world. That's it right there. What does that mean? What does that mean? The symptom of humanity is that all of humankind is crossing the threshold of the spiritual world. It's really saying that our evolutionary journey is asking of us to once again open up to the spiritual realm that was known to our ancestors. They connected with the spiritual world, they connected with spiritual beings, they connected with the creative forces of the cosmos and of the planet. They were connected to the ancestors, the so-called dead. We've closed that off to develop this intellect and to develop this individual nature. You know, it's been an evolutionary imperative that we do have this closure off from the spiritual world to develop an individual nature and to develop individual freedom, so that now, out of that freedom, or seeking of freedom, we can once again open the window back to see the ancestors, to see the spiritual hierarchy, to see the elemental beings that are amongst us and in us and working through us, and to partnership with them. And when we don't, that is a source of pathology. Matter of fact, there's somewhere where Steiner says that if we're not paying attention to the so-called dead, it really blocks our power and we will suffer abdominal pain. So what is this threshold? This threshold that we're needing to navigate, it's like a membrane, it's like a veil between this world and the other world. And I always like to pull out my little rubber ring. Everything was originally a circle, everything was whole in the beginning, but right now we're in this dualistic state. So we experience the two halves of the whole separately. We experience the physical world while we're awake, and then we experience the spiritual world either when we're asleep and out of the body or when we've died. So there's this back and forth flow between the two aspects of the whole, and guess what's at the middle?
Threshold.
The threshold. Thank you. Yes, that's the thing we have to learn how to navigate, and if we don't, that's where we're getting the symptoms, the pathologies, and the out of balanceness, and so forth. And, well, you might even just call it disruption. That our individual lives and the lives of society will be disrupted because this, what's on the other side of the spiritual world is pressing in on us. And wherever it can find a crack, and those that are a little bit cracked, it's going to come through. And there's gifts in that. There's gifts in the autistic nature. There's gifts in the schizophrenic. There's gifts in all of us when there's those cracks where light can come through. And if we pay more attention to that and to develop ourselves in a relationship to the other side, it's not going to feel like disruption. It's going to feel like a wonderful activity, which is why I called my website Partnership Planet, because it's all about partnership with all these other levels and dimensions and beings, and how exciting that is. It's beyond just human beings. There's a whole pantheon of other beings for us to connect with. So, but unfortunately, what science is teaching, what's in the textbooks, what's actually in the institutionalized trainings of our day, is imposing a false threshold. It's imposing this more like a ceiling. And I like to spell that S-E-A-L-I-N-G, because they're saying there's nothing beyond your five senses. Anything you think that's going on in your head is just hooky pook and unreliable. Yeah, like, just give it a rest and, just stick with the scientific methodology, which I said is a great tool. But, I don't take my hammer and whack myself over the head with it just because it's a great tool. So science has, imposed this ceiling with the paradigm that we're living in now, this unprecedented paradigm. And it's out of that paradigm that we're treating people with mental illness. Go figure. So we're cut off from the source, we're cut off from our inner life, we're cut off from our own soul. The ceiling. And so we go for help, but out of this paradigm, we're treated, as a mechanical item. There's still this mechanistic view of the universe and all life that's in it, or we're treated kind of like maybe a little bit better than an animal. The Freudian model of things really isn't much better than just you're being driven by animal instincts and things like that. So, again, we are spiritual beings having a human experience. We have come down from the heights, from higher places. We are gods in the making, coming into this human form to deal with the trials and tribulations, to develop that equilibrium, equanimity, and wholeness. So it's humbling. It's humbling to come from the high stature that we have as divine beings and to be kind of shoehorned into these shoeboxes, as I think of it. Just these tight little spaces. But it's the spiritual, it's the evolutionary imperative of this time to deal with that. But at the same time, to be able to extend our consciousness beyond that threshold. Here's a quote from Rudolf Steiner, which he said this 100 years ago. It may be said that if the people drawn to psychoanalysis are earnestly searching for the spiritual foundations of existence, the inner realities of the soul. Okay, so that's really what psychoanalysis is trying to evolve towards, is these spiritual foundations of existence. They don't know it. But it is a characteristic of our times that many are becoming aware of the workings of the human soul, and psychoanalysts are those who are forced to hit upon certain peculiar activities of soul life. All right, the anomalies and so forth, the so-called disorders. But people who concern themselves with these matters lack the means of knowledge required for understanding them. So we may say psychoanalysis is a phenomenon of our time which compels people to take account of soul processes, but within adequate methods of understanding. This is important to know because this analysis by inadequate means leads to a variety of serious errors. Yeah, so there's serious errors out there. There's a little side thing here, which I call meditation, medication, and mental health. I've been doing training with the Clairvision School of Meditation for about 10 years now, which was started by Samuel Sagan, who's a medical doctor from France. And somebody put the question to him once while I was there, what do you do if someone's having a schizophrenic episode? So this is the head of this school, a guy who's written books on entity possession and past life therapy and all sorts of things. And he said, get them their medication as quickly as possible. And I was shocked. It's like, oh, there's got to be a meditation technique or a mantra or an asana or something to get them doing. But, in all fairness, there is that option for people that are struggling with that, and it can help to bring a sense of order and calm and semblance so they can function. So I just want to be clear that I'm not discarding that as an option, but it's kind of a backup, really. It's a backup. Because some of these conditions that are developing don't have a magic bullet. As we know, pharmaceuticals for schizophrenia and stuff like that is not going to make it go away. It really more or less masks it. So these things have developed in our time for a reason. It's partly collective karma, the collective karma that's going on, and I'll be talking more about that in 2 weeks. And also personal karma. That people come in and they need a particular challenge, a particular thing that blocks them, an obstacle, you could say, that they have to work with for a lifetime. And we need to think in terms of more than just one lifetime. I mean, you can talk about how you are where you are right now because of your past life or 2 or 3 or 5 lives. But you're also working on the next life and the next life and the next life right now. So think of that. I think of that when I go out and, or when I was younger and, you just head turning women here and there, it's like that. So I realized, I'm actually shopping for what I'm going to be like in my next incarnation. I'm looking at women that are the kind of women I want to be like. Because you're attracted to a certain feature, and it's like you like it because, well, maybe you'd like to be like that when you're a woman, when I'm a woman. So we have to, when we talk about going beyond the threshold, we have to look beyond the threshold of just the one life. And that's part of the soul wisdom that we need to bring into our society. Because there are different thresholds. Let me talk a bit more about this threshold. Because there is the threshold of the lifetime, right? So when you enter in birth, you cross the threshold from the spiritual world into the physical world and into a little body that grows and grows and grows, and you have this little house, and you have it for as long as you're alive, and then you cross the threshold again back into the spiritual world. And I actually have this biography chart based on this very idea. It's from a book called The Human Life, and it shows the phases of the human life and how it's a descent down into matter, the developmental years down into midlife, and later on. This parabola here, that was actually part of a wave. So here's the threshold at the top where you enter in, but the wave goes up to when you were in the spiritual world for years and years and years. And then the previous descent and the previous life. And likewise here, this exit from your body up into the spiritual world, up into what they call the midnight sun, and then a descent down into another life. So you have this wave. This is just part of a wave with these thresholds. So
where's that from, if I may ask?
that's from a book called The Human Life, written by a gentleman called O'Neill. Yeah, which I use. It's used in a therapeutic method called biography work, studying your own personal biography. People don't pay enough attention to their lives, but the events in your lives are loaded with information about you and your karma. Because everybody here has a completely unique set of circumstances. No two people are alike. And I like to say that the signature of the self, the greater self, is in the circumstances. You do create your own circumstances. You do create your own reality. They're mirroring something to you. So this is a means for studying your own life biography, your own life picture, and getting information. And that's extending your consciousness beyond the threshold. Because the information you get doing that is nothing that science could ever tell you about yourself. They can only tell you what you are physically, and maybe, kind of pigeonhole you psychologically. That's DSM. But with this kind of work, we're activating ourselves. This is self-activation, self-initiation, to access knowledge in new means, which Steiner referred to as the new imagination, the new inspiration, and the new intuition, all with a capital I. We have imagination. Like children have active imagination, we say, when they're playing with dolls and they imagine things. But that's really just the seed of the new clairvoyance, the new spiritual capacities that we need to develop consciously. In the old clairvoyance, it was just given to the ancestors, as gifts of the gods, more or less. And the gods descended into humans and produced thoughts within the humans and produced visions and so forth. And we still have these older means through the shamanistic traditions around, using plant spirit medicine and so forth, where people can open up clairvoyant space, vision space, plant spirits come in, different beings come in and give them visions. But it's an unconscious process. When I was down in the Amazon 2 years ago, drinking rather strong ayahuasca and laid out flat on the floor of the jungle, I was filled with all sorts of visions and things. I wasn't conscious though. I had laid down. I was conscious, semi-conscious, but my will wasn't necessarily engaged. I had taking these things is really referred to as a form of controlled possession. You're letting something possess you and think and produce activity within you for the period that you're under the influence of the plant spirit medicine. So that's a bit connected to the old clairvoyance. And when I was down there, and the second night I had a whopper of a journey, and I was like, whoa, this is not my path. I still stayed and did 8 more to see what would happen. But I realized, the new path, the new clairvoyance, is being able to do this stuff consciously and out of the development of your own will, which takes repetition and the employment of sound spiritual practices that address the architecture of modern consciousness, right? So finding a systematic path that you work at for years, you can get to that state. There are people that do shamanistic journeys without the assistance of plant spirit beings. And I think that really is the main objective, because even after doing 20 ayahuasca ceremonies, I had to first of all reel myself back in and kind of put myself together because there was some fallout. There's some things I had to deal with that weren't so great, mostly around the shaman himself, not so much the plant spirit. But I had to work with the visions I was given. And I would say that's what brought me right here, right now, doing this. It ignited a passion in me to work with spiritual science and modern practices, spiritual practices that develop the will, that develop the heart, that develop the mind. I guess I'll start off talking about my schizophreniform disorder, which is, schizophreniform is obviously connected to schizophrenia, but it's schizophreniform because it's an episode that lasts less than 6 months, which I probably have had a few over the years, but the biggie was when I turned 20 and was out at Western University just studying for a BA, bugger all. And you haven't heard that one before? Well, you know what BS stands for, right? And then MS is more the same, and then PhD is just piled higher and deeper. So I didn't actually finish my BA because of this schizophreniform episode that I had. Basically, I was in a bad mix of things, hanging out with the wrong crowd. I was daily doping, just doing lots of cannabis, dabbling in the occult and black arts, testing my psychic abilities in different ways, and not being very grounded, not having a good community of people around to mirror me. I was kind of running Lone Ranger mode, and came to this conclusion, which lasted for several weeks, that I was the savior of the world.
Oh my.
That I was actually the second coming of Christ. And it was comforting to find out a few years later that I'm not the only person that has come to that conclusion. There's quite a few of us around. So good to know I'm not doing it. I'm not the one.
The Dire Straits song. Two of them say they're Jesus, one must be wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. But this was also wrapped in with a very important stage of development when I turned 20, and that's your 21st year. And with this biography chart based on spiritual science, that's a time where you've developed your physical body to a certain extent, your etheric body, your astral body. So you have these sheaths into which the ego self is to come in and basically sit on the throne. But of course there's forces and obstacles that want to oppress that event from happening. And yeah, I got kind of kittywampus at that stage with this bad mix that I was talking about. Kittywampus?
Are
Yeah.
you serious? That is a word that I thought that me and my friend made up.
Oh, you're delusional, my friend. Delusions of grandeur. It's alright, you're in good company. And so I had lots of delusions of grandeur going on at that time, and I was interpreting everything going on in my life, that angels were getting ready to come and tell me, exactly how to be the savior of the world and how to unpack this whole thing as the second coming. And one of the guys I was living with in this house there in the second year, he was Catholic, and he was always talking about this stuff, and he didn't know what I was thinking in my mind, but he mentioned that Christ was not coming back in a physical body. that sort of created a problem for my delusion. But he did mention that there was going to be an Antichrist coming. And as I said, things were getting kind of kittywampus, and I was seeing things not working so well. And so my ego needing something to grab onto that made it felt really big, came to the conclusion that I was the Antichrist in the flesh, because I was seeing things. I was seeing how I was hurting people through this misuse of psychic powers and black magic and whatnot. And I thought, well, geez, I'm working for the dark side. I must be the dark one. I'm the Antichrist. So, needless to say, things got pretty dark, and then eventually the light went out completely, and I was pretty much a mess. And when I did drop out after Christmas of that year, unbeknownst to my parents, I went to the office of the registrar and I said, "Is there any money left in the account?" And they said yes, and so they wrote me a check for a few $100s, and I went to the airport and bought a plane ticket to Jamaica.
Good choice.
Well, I'll continue my higher education in the mountains of Jamaica. So I went to Jamaica and found a guy who drove me up into the mountains, and I lived up there for a few weeks in this completely remote village with some Jamaicans, and thought that that's where, you know, I would rest myself for the rest of my life. But that didn't pan out. That was a bit of a pipe dream, you might say, and I did make it back to my parents' basement in the suburbs of Etobicoke to once again try and figure out what's my path of liberation of consciousness. So, I mean, it was actually probably one of the most profound episodes of my life. It was tied into a spiritual awakening, and it informs my life to this day, and the work that I do, and my spiritual questing. But it took several years to overcome that. I was completely decimated. My personality was completely changed. I basically didn't have any personality. I was like an empty shell. And I couldn't even go outside my parents' house without having like panic attacks and freaking out. As a matter of fact, from the moment I awoke in the morning, it was like a bolt of fear. That instant I had consciousness, I was struck with fear that plagued me all day long. It exhausted me, but I couldn't get rid of it. I was living in terror. This theme of terror. So I won't go into how I evolved from there, but it was really as a parabola or trajectory. It was like this, whoa, very, very high, as high as I've ever been in terms of expansion and crossing the threshold, and then plummeting down into the depths of darkness, and then having to find my way out of that hole bit by bit. Studying spiritual things. I became part of a Christian ministry for a few years after that. I studied the Bible for a few years, and that was helpful to you know, as far as me being the savior of the world, or the dark one of the world. Well, yeah, I am still the savior of the world and the dark one of the world. As we all are. We all really are bringing this, the new consciousness. We all, you might say, are the second coming of consciousness. But at the same time, we all have that potential of being operatives for the dark side. Every day, every breath, we have that potential to be seduced and used and puppeted and so forth by those forces. So, at the essence of what I was believing, there was a truth, but I was not interpreting it properly. As I said, I didn't have a good community to mirror to me in a healthy way and to hold me so that I could stand in my own center, my own ego selfhood, and be all the power that I can be, as we all can be, and not get seduced and drawn into this erroneous thinking. So, and also leads me to this question around marijuana and mental health, because I was smoking a lot at the time. And marijuana is something that's growing in our culture. There's very much a cannabis culture. But it's a double-edged sword. We really need to understand what we're dealing with here, the power of it as a plant spirit medicine. Because it is a plant spirit medicine amongst thousands of plant spirit medicines, and it has its own particular personality, its own particular intellect and power upon you. And so it has certainly beneficial uses, helping people with glaucoma, helping people with cancer treatment, appetite loss, pain management. I don't know, some of you may have even more insight into what's being used for in the medical marijuana community. Anybody else offer other benefits?
Writing songs.
Writing songs. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. It definitely has its power. So, the question is how to use that power in a responsible way. And of course there is a certain amount of irresponsibility around the cannabis culture because it's being manipulated and other things added to it and hybridized and so forth. So, it's way stronger now than when I was smoking it back in university. It has hallucinogenic power sometimes. And I smoked a little bit just after I did the ayahuasca, and it was like an ayahuasca experience. It was quite dramatic. Just like 2 puffs and 4 hours later. So the thing with marijuana is, increases the sensitivity that we have because it activates that zoom lens of consciousness. So, it can zoom in, it can focus us in on minute details of things, but the zoom can also open up into an expansiveness which can make us very open and it's sometimes vulnerable because of that openness. So, the question is, where is your will? Where are you in that influence? And how is it benefiting you as a spiritual being having a human experience? Is it assisting that or not? And there's been some recent studies, participants who had no psychotic symptoms and had never tried marijuana when the study began, then started using marijuana, had nearly doubled the risk of experiencing psychotic episodes. Those who used marijuana before the start of the study and then continued to use over the study period had an increased risk of persistent psychotic symptoms. This clarifies that it is not psychosis that leads to cannabis use, but rather the reverse. The cannabis can exacerbate psychotic conditions. It can influence that. Quote, in light of these findings, it is likely that cannabis precipitates schizophrenia in people who are vulnerable due to personal or family history of schizophrenia. The study links marijuana use to earlier age onset of schizophrenia. So that's not one of the conditions that you want to use medical marijuana for. Schizophrenia and multiple personality, things like that. Why? Let's talk about alcohol a little bit, right? Like that's perfectly legal, and oh yay, the Premier of Ontario is now going to make it so we can get wine in the supermarkets throughout Ontario. I thought that was a bit insulting to hear that announcement last week because they're preparing to crack down on distribution of raw milk in Ontario, which I'm a fan of. I thought I was allergic to milk, but when I discovered raw milk, it became a superfood for me. And Premier Wynne doesn't want to deal with it. She's just completely zipped her lips. She won't talk to anybody about this raw milk thing that's coming up. There's an injunction in March up at the courthouse in Newmarket. If anybody wants to go up there and protest March 16th, I can drive you up. Because they may make it illegal to drink or distribute raw milk in Ontario. Yeah. I mean, you could, shouldn't say you can't drink it, but you can't sell or distribute it. There's a lot, if you're a farmer and you got a cow, they can't say it's illegal to drink raw milk from your cow.
Michael Schmidt's been
And-
fighting that for years.
Yeah, well, Michael Schmidt's a friend of mine, and I own part of, not one of his cows, but another farmer's cow. So I actually own, I think, 1/8 of a teat, or something like that. So I am a owner of a cow, but they're going to say, like, I'm not going to be able to get it and drink it, which is really, I'm kind of crying over no raw milk. So anyways, alcohol, very accessible and legal. It dissolves boundaries, right? They call it a social lubricant because it dissolves your boundaries, your inhibitions, and whatnot drop. We use alcohol as a solvent, right? To dissolve guck and so forth. So what is it doing when you put it into your body? Even at like 4.5% in a beer, things like that. It does have this dissolution capacity on your subtle bodies, right? Like there's the physical body, but then you have this etheric body, which is even more delicate in a sense in your astral body, and then the ego self is trying to sit in those sheaths, and actually your blood is the interface of the ego self with the physical body, and we know alcohol thins the blood. So there's really this dissolving effect that makes one more permeable when they consume alcohol. And they call it getting intoxicated because it is a toxic substance, which in the past had its benefits. In the older mysteries and mystery schools, they use substances such as alcohol, potentized alcohol and whatnot, that would be administered to a neophyte during a ritual initiation. And they'd be given this so that there'd be this dissolving of the sheaths of the subtle bodies, and the Hierophant, the one conducting the initiation, would then guide the soul and spirit, the astral body, you could say, out of the physical body, and this could last for up to 3 days. The being who was being initiated would have crossed the threshold, and they'd be with spiritual beings in the spiritual world that'd be working upon them and imprinting upon them information, coding, capacities, and so forth. And then at the end of the initiation, when the substance had been worn off, the potion, if you will, they'd be brought back into the body, and they'd have a different personality. So that was one of the uses of alcohol at that time, to go beyond the barriers so that people could be initiated. We don't need to do that these days because we do that every night, and we need to do that consciously every night. Every night we go out of our body. Your ego self and your astral body leave the physical body, go into the spiritual realm, and as I explained 2 weeks ago, you're working with guardian angel and other beings and human beings that are not incarnated, working on the events of the day that you take up, your experiences, your biography. You're working on those things in the spiritual world at night, on the other side of the threshold, and in the morning you cross the threshold again and you get glimpses of that through your dreams, but you carry a new seed of an impulse that you need to realize is there and connect with during the day and live from that, from a living spiritual impulse and a living spiritual thinking, and not just dead, lifeless, pattern, habit type of thing. So alcohol, it's as with the paradigm shift, it's now not necessary, and in fact is somewhat destructive to our nature, and it can undermine our ability to connect with the spiritual world, because it is a spirit and it actually brings in a false self. It's a plant spirit being that's very potentized, and when you consume it, Steiner refers to it as interior imitation of sunshine that now interferes with the development of the self, because this the self that we're developing, which you could sometimes refer to as the I am presence, the I am consciousness, is the true light of the world. You have that true light of the world within you, and the I am presence that's growing and developing in the new paradigm. So to bring in these, what you could call false fires, false selves, he refers to it as the anti-self, and it can actually be a direct attack upon the I am presence. So it's also damaging your etheric body. You call it your prana body, your chi body, which is the seat of memory. Our memory is imprinted on this etheric body, and so it will be harder for you to connect with your past life information because of this dissolving and weakening of the etheric body with alcohol. And in fact, it's harder to connect with true spiritual knowledge because of the presence of this in your system. So now, it's wonderful to read some of Steiner's stuff around this because he just leaves people free. You know, like he gives them the information, but he doesn't like wag his finger and says, "Oh, you shouldn't have that beer." You know, like I've consumed lots of alcohol over the years, and when I go for dinner, I like to sniff people's wine. You know, because it is an amazing gift, and you know, it does have certain medicine to it. You know, it can be used. You know, as St. Paul said, a little wine for thy stomach's sake. You know, there may be a time to use it, but overall, it really is not offering anything beneficial to our spiritual development. In fact, Steiner says it adds a dead weight to the body. You'll feel this levity when you drink it, you know, when you're at the party and you're wearing the lampshade and everything's all happy, you know, good time Charlie. But you know how you feel the next day. You know, you got a headache because it's not good for the brain, and it's puts you, you know, there's a spiritual gravity that's pulling down that's going to be a counterweight to this this levity, which I skipped over my little thing, and that's basically how we can look at bipolar symptoms. I've been talking about this the last few talks about, you know, there's a spiritual levity and there's a spiritual gravity. You know, the levity is pulling us up into growth and into the higher heights, and gravity keeps us grounded. It keeps us in our body, keeps us working in the earth. This is where our work is. It's not necessarily like getting out of the body. It's in the body, in the earth, transforming the material world. That's our job. That's our future. We're going to eventually transform our physical bodies. So I look at bipolar symptoms. They call it disorder, but that's just another like, oh, you're out of order. You know, you better call a technician. It's another initiatory opportunity. It's another initiatory opportunity to find that equanimity and wholeness, because you're in the swinging from the heights to the depths. So the thing is to build up that center, to build up that consciousness, starting with attention and moving out from there. Has anybody ever seen that thing floating around the internet called 30 Signs You're an Empath? And it's rather quite negative. I haven't got time to go through it right now. Matter of fact, if I had time, I was going to take you through the obsessive compulsive checklist to see how you fit in there. Okay, do you have fears of contracting dreadful illness? Yeah. Okay, feelings of revulsion about bodily waste and secretions? Yeah. Concerns about sticky substances or residues? All the time. You need to align objects just so? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Concerns about the neatness of one's personal appearance or one's environment? Yep. Stashing away useless things such as old newspapers or items. I got a whole wall of stuff like that behind there. And you know what? A lot of it goes from useless to useful. The inability to discard anything because it may be needed sometime. Yeah. Unwanted sexual thoughts. fears that one may be homosexual, repeating routine activities for no logical reason. Not on. So, but here's a good one here, that the belief that certain numbers are lucky or unlucky. The need for symmetry and total order in one's environment. For example, you need to line up canned goods in the pantry in alphabetical order, to hang clothes in the exact same spot in the closet every day, or to wear certain clothes only on certain days. The need to keep doing something until one gets it right. Well, I invested quite a bit in doing the biogeometry training. And biogeometry training is about placing things just right, to get things lined up in order, to use patterns in geometry, because biogeometry, the geometry supports biological life of humans, plants, and animals. So, it's just a matter of how you want to frame that. I feel like people that have this sensitivity and this need to bring order, through repetition and whatnot, it's just somewhere on the spectrum of normal behavior that just kind of needs to be fine-tuned and find balance with other things. Like we all have a little piece of the puzzle, and when we bring it together and find wholeness, then it's like, oh great, you do that, we need somebody who does that. Well, you got a garage full of useless junk? I'd like to check it out. I bet you I could use some of that. I'll bring my truck over. 30 most common traits of an empath. This really bothered me because it's also a negative. I'm an empath. I practice empathy every day in the work with people. I teach how to develop empathy, but here it's like, oh, if you're an empath, being in public places is overwhelming. Feeling others' emotions and taking them on as your own. Picking up physical symptoms of another. Digestive disorders and lower back problems. Constant fatigue. Addictive personality. Alcohol, drugs, sex are to name but a few addictions that empaths turn to. Abhors clutter. Gets bored or distracted easily. Finds it impossible to do things they don't enjoy. Loves to daydream. Find routine, rules, or control imprisoning. Prone to carry weight without necessarily overeating. I mean, I see people like that, and I agree, like some people are caught in these things, but we are called to be empathic. We are called to be able to experience what's going on outside of ourselves. It's basically what empathy is. But if you've built up your center, you can extend your consciousness beyond the threshold of your own being and to be in the space and the experience of another, and then be able to come back to your center. Which brings me to talking about the different thresholds. We already talked about life and death being the threshold, as well as sleeping and waking. But the most healthy threshold to be working with consciously is the other. The threshold between you and another human being. And that is a practice. That's really what we need in developing our society, is how to have empathy to experience what someone else is going through and support them in their experience with good mirroring, with active listening. I'm developing a dyad network right now, and you'll probably hear more about this in the future because it's part of a spiritual boot camp I want to start next September. And part of it is learning to dyad, to be in pairs where you learn to facilitate another human being in their process. How to help somebody process soul substance by using empathy. If I'm doing that, I'm not going to take on your symptoms. I'm not going to take on your emotions. I'm not going to walk away and it's like, oh my gosh, I got to go home and rest and shower and I can't leave the house for a couple of days and I have to smudge and all that. So no, you develop the sheaths and the alacrity of consciousness to go beyond yourself. And that's so healthy because we can't stay stuck in our self-centered if we're going to evolve as spiritual beings having a human experience. Just going to touch on some other things quickly. Kundalini syndrome. won't go into detail, but it's important to understand this with the proliferation of yoga culture here in the West, that doing exercises, breathing, asanas and whatnot, you can activate your kundalini, and if you're not managing it properly, you can get kundalini sickness, where the kundalini's awakened and you're not raising it through the blocks properly. You haven't worked on your psychology, your energy, and so you end up suppressing it, and it can manifest physical pain, psychotic episodes. There was a big rash of this back in the 60s because there was, of course, an interest in Eastern teachings back in the 60s, and there was plenty of gurus that wanted to come over to America and have disciples and teach and just give out Shaktipat, which is awakening of energy. But, you know, in the yogic tradition, you have to go through preparation, years of preparation and discipline and service and whatnot. You just don't like come to some kind of hippie thing in a field and have some guru like, that's really black magic. And a lot of people got sick, and so they were setting up Kundalini stations all around North America for people that were having these anomalies. They were going nuts and you know, all sorts of aberrations in their health. So,
Which
you know,
looks a lot like the schizophrenia or psychosis. and
Yeah.
all that.
yeah, absolutely. It could set off that kind of thing. So, I do want to touch on autism because that's a huge one in our times, and it's growing, and it raises many questions. You know, for example, I'll just read you some of the questions it would bring out. Normally, was there a previous underreporting? Is autism really new, or was there a previous underreporting of it? Is this diagnosis being overused now, and so it appears like there's more of it? And has it become a dumping ground for a range of inexplicable anomalies in human development? Oh, well, there's somewhere on the autistic spectrum, you know, Asperger's or what, like just dump them in the autism label. Is it genetic? Is it environmental? Is it due to the increase of vaccinations? There's a growing concern that that is what's causing it, because, boy, the number of vaccinations you need nowadays to get into the playground compared to what it was, you know, a generation ago is astronomical. Is it from allergies and foodstuffs and gastrointestinal problems? Or are these just contributing factors to a situation that is already unfolding as part of this symptom that Steiner refers to, the symptom of humanity being how we're not successfully navigating this thing called threshold between the physical world and the spiritual world. So I probably don't need to cover, you know, what autism looks like. There's lots out there, and you've probably all read about it. But again, it can have this supermind quality, the savant who has very highly developed capacities in some ways, but they can have very low IQ at the same time. What's happening here really is a widening of the gulf between the spiritual world and the physical world. We're not bridging it. So these autistic people really are residing more on the other side. That's why they seem kind of childlike and even babyish, you could say, because babies and children are mostly living on the other side of the threshold in those early years. Their body's not there strong enough to completely incarnate who they are as a spiritual being, right? So that's why we read fairy tales and magical stories to children, because they're still connected to the magical fluid dimensional realm. And same with the autistic people. For whatever reason, they are residing more on that other side, and we see sometimes flashes of their personality into this world. I guess we can turn that stove off. It's getting hot in here, so thanks. we see flashes, certain like little slivers of light come through. And if you ever think that they don't need love or companionship or any of the human things that we all crave, like to have meaning, to have work in their life, you're wrong. They need it just as much, if not more, than, quote, normal human beings. And in fact, I had the privilege to volunteer for a couple of years in a Camp Hill village, which is a worldwide network of intentional communities that were inspired by Rudolf Steiner through a Dr. Karl Koenig, an Austrian doctor who went and set up this first community in Camp Hill, Scotland, back in, I believe, the 1940s. And now there's over 100 of them around the world, and there's one up just west of Barrie, Camp Hill, Nottawasaga, and I volunteered there for a couple of years. And you actually live with these people. You live in the houses with them, you eat with them, you work with them. It's a completely equanimous community of autistic people and Down syndrome and you know, these other sorts of conditions. And everybody has a place in the Campbell village. Everybody contributes what they can, and everybody takes out equally. It's a beautiful microcosm of, you know, the global village and what it should be. And I've never been in a place with such a presence. It was so lovely. I'd love to retire there. It's, you know, a farm-based thing where they have cows and they have a biodynamic garden, and they celebrate the festivals. There's lots of arts, and it's got everything. But you're with people that are very challenged. You know, they need help right down to the minutest detail. But they are, in a sense, the medicine for our culture, because they bring out in us those virtues that we need to bring out of goodness, beauty, and truth. So, like, we're all different pieces of the puzzle. They're different sides to the coin. So there's something going on here evolutionarily where, yeah, they live more on the other side of the threshold and we live on this side of the threshold, and we're trying to bridge this gap in learning how to connect together. You know, part of why this is happening is because the fragmentation of our times. Right? We really are in a fragmenting society where we are not held in a tribal culture, right? Which was very cohesive, and everybody had their place, and there was the elders and leaders and so forth, and you were, you know, part of that organism. You were a member of that organism. We don't have a tribal culture anymore. There's this fragmentation taking place. And so, in a way, we need to find a neo-tribalism to support this individuation that's taking place and must take place. There needs to be this breakdown of the tribal culture. There needs to be what you could say is a cutting of blood ties, right? Where the blood tie thing is of the past. You know, like, I'm the descendant of this, the descendant of this. Like, the hereditary information is of the past. We're needing to grab our spiritual nature to pull ourselves into the future. So, you know, even the breakdown of the family unit and things are an evolutionary imperative that is going to help us be set free, right? But we need to find our freedom legs, and that's what's happening with this fragmentation. You find people that are fragmented because they're not being held as part of a tribal culture. They're not being held as part of a bloodline, which is good, but we're in that transitory period of now finding the new paradigm, the neo-tribalism of a free will. What did I say at the last meeting? I'm saying, you know, that the cosmos is trying to produce self-aware, self-directed, free will beings who live out of a wisdom-based love and part of an interdependent unit. So we're not there yet. So we see this fragmentation. We see people that are sort of like falling through the cracks. And that's why Steiner says the symptom of humanity is that all of humankind is crossing the threshold of the spiritual world. And we need to learn how to do that together so we can rebuild some cohesion. In terms of the threshold, I'll kind of combine this with my piece here on entheogens, or psychoactive substances. In the last two chapters of this book called Knowledge of the Higher Worlds, Steiner talks about the lesser guardian of the threshold and the greater guardian of the threshold. And you can think of the greater guardian as the higher self or the God self or the divine nature that's there, that is holding the promise of the future. And we all feel that. We all feel something of the promise of the future, and we see it off in the distance. Cross the threshold, come, make the journey. But then there's this lower guardian of the threshold also there. And who's that? Well, this lower guardian of the threshold is really composed of all your past deeds and thoughts and emotions. Some people call it the doppelganger, the double, the other part of you. Can you imagine meeting that character who holds all your thoughts, deeds, and feelings from the past lives? You ready to meet that one? That's what's standing between the promise of the future is this guy who holds your past. And it's unconscious. So we have to start doing the soul work to make it conscious. That's where karmic work comes in, to start to get a sense of what we bring from past lives. And let that inform our actions. Let that inform our work and destiny. Because it's like compost that will help us to grow that future and build that bridge to the greater guardian of the future, of the threshold, who holds that promise of the future. So this is why it's not easy. If people are going to ignore the lower guardian of the threshold, they're going to get troubles. You know, I've experienced it. We've all experienced it. And that's just part of the name of the game of expanding consciousness. People think it's so easy to acquire knowledge these days. You know, a few clicks and boy, you got it there on Wikipedia. It's not that easy as people think. Knowledge always has a price. And the price of higher knowledge really is self-knowledge. You have to pay the lower guardian of the threshold in order to get access to the higher guardian of the threshold. Self-knowledge. And this is why Carl Jung, the famous Swiss psychoanalyst, he wasn't that crazy about using psychedelics and psychoactive substances because he thought that it was too easy. There was a revelation of knowledge and vision that you hadn't really earned. And there is a danger in that. I mean, I think there's even a danger sometimes going to psychics or whatnot, and they tell you all this sorts of stuff, and you get all this information, and you haven't really developed the discernment or the will to know what to do with that knowledge. And it can mess you up. You know, like someone says, oh, you're going to marry that person that you're thinking about. You know, I've seen that go south. So, the thing around entheogens, like ayahuasca and whatnot, again, it will do the work for you to dissolve those boundaries, dissolve the threshold, and boy, you see incredible things, get incredible information. It's not a magic bullet. It does open the window for you, and that's great, and there's a time for it. I'm not taking any kind of moral stance around these things, whether it's good or bad. You really have to determine if it's the medicine for you and when. And I think, you know, for Western society, we've been fed so much crap and bullshit, you know, physically and intellectually, that sometimes we need that stick of dynamite to blow the lid off and realize, wow, you know, like the year before I went down to the Amazon, I went scuba diving in Costa Rica, and it was like, wow, boy, this stuff underneath the surface here is amazing. Swimming with sharks and stuff like that. The next year I went to the Amazon and did ayahuasca, and it was like, scuba diving is nothing. Boy, you know, this is really swimming in a whole new world. So, But there's a two-way street that goes on here, where we employ the power of plant spirit medicine, where it can lead to addiction. I mean, Gabor Mate is using ayahuasca to help people to overcome methadone addiction and heroin addiction and things like that. So, it's great. It's definitely amazing. And there's like thousands of plant spirit medicine in the Amazon. It's like I could probably spend the rest of my life just exploring, experimenting them all. But there's always the risk of that plant spirit taking over, because it is a form of controlled possession, and people don't necessarily get out of the influence of that plant spirit because they haven't developed the will, they haven't developed the discipline, they haven't gone through a training. So it's a double-edged sword. It's a double-edged sword, and it can lead to addictions, which then become a whole nother battle. So yeah, there's dangers with dabbling. There's dangers with dabbling, not only with that, but also mention occultism. Like it gets into slippery waters when you are working with magic and psychic powers, which we do need to develop these things. That's the new technology, really. We are the new technology, so we need to take those risks, be the new pioneers with the new technology, but be aware that these things can lead to entity possession, which expresses itself as mental illness. Some people schizophrenic and multiple personalities. It's they went for biscuits and they never came back. Something else is then they're in the machine, so to speak, and that can ultimately lead to a crossing of the death threshold in the wrong way, which is suicide. That you don't want to cross the threshold by a suicide, but that can happen when you get into those deep waters with drugs and occultism and what. So, oh yes, terror. Yeah, terror is something we have to deal with in approaching the threshold. Largely because this lower guardian, the threshold, holds all the good, the bad, and the ugly, and everything from your past. And finding a way to deal with that is another book. The last book I'll show you, Secrets of the Yellow Brick Road, a map for the modern spiritual journey, written by Jesse Stewart. He wrote a book. Yes. With your Get Moving guidebook. And in this I developed a modality I call the Oscope, where I actually help people to go across the threshold consciously by taking them into a waking dreaming state. So they're awake, but they go into that dream time, and I take them across the Rainbow Bridge, the threshold, into their own personal land of Oz, where they get to see in the dream time these different Oz characters as representational symbols of their own soul and spirit capacities, and to interact with those parts of themselves that are usually running unconscious, as they were for Dorothy. Right? When she was in Kansas, she was completely unconscious of what was running the show. There needed to be an initiatory journey. She needed to cross the threshold, with that tornado landing her house in Oz, and then go on a journey. She picks up the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Lion, which represent her capacity to think, to feel, and to will. And they get initiated and activated and working as a whole unit. There's that wholeness and equanimity. Dorothy got it in Oz. So in my Oscope, I take people in, a bit at a time, to encounter these different parts. The Wicked Witch, the Not-So-Wonderful Wizard, Glinda, the Higher Self, and so forth. And to begin to come to that self-knowledge, which is the price you got to pay for, expanded consciousness.
Where
Yes?
do I sign up?
Yeah.
We can talk later. Yeah. So, and just a little side note, I can't resist telling this. When I finished this book, it was quite a task that I finally did something I'd wanted to do for years, and that was to write a play, which was actually a musical called Oz Recalled, and it was about Dorothy as a middle-aged, burnout movie star who trips over an electrical cable on a movie set and gets electrocuted, sent back to Oz again, where the Munchkins greet her and they're so annoyed because she's completely forgotten about them. She just, lost consciousness and went to, La La Land of LA to work on movies. And then she had to go and find her Tin Man Scarecrow and Lion again, who this time, in my version of it, had gone to the opposite extreme. The Scarecrow was not looking for his brain, he had it, but he wasn't working as a unit, so he was this overbearing, intellectual, over-analytical, obnoxious, annoying, nerd. Tin Man had his heart, but was this so passionate, kept falling in love with anything, and he kept falling apart at the sight of any woman. Matter of fact, they ran out of tin to patch him up, so they had to find drums to patch him up. So when he comes out, he's actually a walking drum kit, and he does his song, "I got so much heart, I'm falling apart." Then when she meets the lion, of course he's the king, right? So Dorothy finds him in the deep dark jungle, and he's hanging out. He's got a whole harem of lionesses. He's the king. He's like this rapper king. I am the king. I can do anything. Got no time for fear. I got courage coming out my ears. So, anyways, that was my showbiz days. I actually produced that. I wrote about 5 or 6 musicals at one point in my life, and had this semi-career in theater, putting on these wacky kind of spiritual musicals.
That sounds fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Playwright? Like the script? Or
Yeah, I got copies kicking around somewhere if anybody wants to read them. Yeah. So the last piece here, and I know I've run over, but I really just feel I need to finish off with the soul care solutions, right? It's really about soul care, and you all know that folk wisdom of the past. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure when it comes to mental health. So, part of our problem is that we are trapped in form as spiritual beings. We're in this form which restricts our movement. In the spiritual world, we have much more movement. So, it's part of the problem is being trapped in this form, but we need to move in this form anyways. So, outer movement is important. And I'm not just talking about jogging, but the way you move is important. And one of the suggestions Steiner makes is to change a habit every month. So for example, change the way you do a particular letter in your signature. Change the way you draw a particular number. That produces movement in your etheric body. The fluid body is the etheric body. So by changing the way you move, it helps with the structuring and strengthening of your sheaths and makes you less vulnerable to the things that can lead to mental illness. Also play. I read an interesting study how there's been a correlation between the rise of mental illness in children and the decline of play. And when I was working in the Waldorf schools, some of the teachers were complaining, it's like, we have to teach children how to play. They don't know how to play. They're cut off from that imagination, because they're put in front of computers and have to type, and all, movies just are imprinting their minds with the images that adults create rather than telling them stories. There's a fellow he was in a Waldorf school. He probably got lots of stories. Story time. That produces inner movement because you are creating your own images as you hear the story. So reading books, obviously, is novels fiction is a great way to stir that inner movement and imagination. And as Einstein said, imagination is more important than knowledge. And if you have imagination, you're going to be able to access knowledge in a much healthier way. And it's not only imagination that leads to inspiration, which is inner hearing, and then intuition, which is inner knowing. Sleep disorders. 50% of all Americans cannot sleep properly. What that's saying is they cannot breathe out into the night and cross the threshold and connect with the spiritual world. If you can't sleep properly, you're not fully getting out of your body, doing the work in night school, and being able to bring fresh spiritual impulses into the new day. So instead of having enlivened spiritual thinking, you're just operating on habits and on things of the past, and you're vulnerable to become a puppet and a parrot to other forces. So it's really important to have good sleep and to cross that threshold at night. So the thing is, people are not digesting the day. And Steiner gives this, probably one of the most important exercises you could do, is what he called the Rückschau. That's German for review. And every day, sometime in the evening, not when you're tired, but when you're still fresh, you review your day. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, doesn't have to be, an hour. It's just that you do it regularly, and you do it backwards. And the reason you do it backwards is because that emulates death. It's like sleep is a mini death. And when we die, we actually review our lives backwards, from the time of death back to the birth or conception. So this Rückschau is a way to digest your day. You've already started doing some of the work that's going to get done on the other side of the threshold. So you're actually crossing the threshold when you do the Rückschau. You're activating your imagination because you picture yourself. There I was there, and then I went there, and then I met this person, and then I ate this, and so forth. And this will grow. If you do it regularly, it'll take on a life of its own, and you'll find you get energy. You get spiritual energy from doing it. And then finally, the karma work. And of course the Rückschau is a form of karma work because you are acquiring self-knowledge. In that Rückschau exercise, you're looking at yourself objectively. You'll be shown things as you remember the day. The higher spiritual beings will be able to pour into your soul images and whatnot. And that's the beginning of karma work, which we really need to take seriously in maintaining equilibrium and mental health, spiritual health. Karma work is not something that science would rubber stamp and say, oh yeah, spend your time doing karma work. They don't believe in karma. They don't believe in reincarnation. They don't believe in any of that stuff. They believe in cause and effect. Scientists say, oh yeah, there's cause and effect on the physical level, but science does not believe that there's a moral quality to life or that there's a moral nature and beingness to the universe. But all of our past cultures and spiritual teachings have believed that. Really, every spiritual teaching has some belief in the afterlife and karma and reincarnation. That, we're not here just once, but that it's part of this wave. We have this spiritual evolution that's taking place. So that's why I set up the next talk as Karma and Reincarnation, Old and New Views. And I was going to bring out, I have a set of books. It's actually 8 volumes of lectures given by Rudolf Steiner. He gave 80 lectures just close to when he was dying. And he said that bringing a clear understanding of karma and reincarnation to the Western world was the main purpose of his incarnation. Like he put it as that high importance that people understand and know how to work with it. And why not? If we have all this other stuff we bring with us, why not include it in our consciousness and our working in this world? It gives direction. It gives direction to your actions. So, to close off, I've got a little gift for you here I'm going to hand out. And it ties into this thing around terror, dealing with terror and fear. At the threshold is something we have to deal with. I mean, if you've done ayahuasca, you realize you cross that threshold, there can be frightening things that you see, visions and so forth. So this is called Steiner's trust meditation, also known as equanimity, which he gave in 1910 as part of a lecture. Let us eradicate from our soul all fear and terror of what comes toward us out of the future. We must think only that whatever comes is given to us by a world direction full of purpose. This is part of what we must learn in this age, to live out of pure trust. Trust in the ever-present help of the spiritual world. Truly, nothing else will do if our courage is not to fail us. Let us discipline our will to awaken this trust within ourselves every morning and every evening.